There are a lot of people who have started with Oil-Dri since our growth in the 90s and who may not be as familiar with where we came from as those of us who've been around for a long time. I actually have been here for 10 years now, but a lot of people haven't been here quite that long. And I thought it'd be important before we start focusing on where we want to get to take a look back and say, where have we come from? Because it's always important to ground ourselves in our history so that we know where we're going. And I was lucky to tap into a special guest today who actually is someone very familiar with Oil-Dri and where we've come from. He was there with my grandpa Nick on the first sale ever to Sears Roebuck. He was there when we bought our first plant. He was there when we went public. He was there during all our growth, and he's here today. And that person is Dick Jaffe, my father. Dad, welcome.
Dan, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to sharing some of these thoughts with you today.
Good. Well, we're happy to have you. And I know before looking back, you were preparing some comments for the team.
Well, what I wanted to make sure everybody understood that while I'm here to provide a historical perspective, that it's been now almost 3 years since you've taken over management of the business, first as president and chief operating officer, and here more recently as chief executive. And the way I tell the story is really, while I congratulate you on your promotions, it's really me who's gotten the promotion. I'm now in the exalted position of chairman. But in a more serious vein, I wanted to make sure that all of our employees and all the many people that I worked with over the years realize how absolutely pleased I am with the direction that you and your team are taking and bringing the company to another level. Sometimes when there's transition of management, those who've been around a while sort of talk about the good old days, but let me assure you that I think the good old days are really ahead of us. The moves that you've made to bring in new and talented and experienced management into every aspect of the business and the initiatives that you have underway, some of which you've talked about in these tapes, and I know we'll continue to talk about, just makes me very, very optimistic for the future. So while I appreciate all the efforts that we've all put forth to bring to the company to the position that we're in today, my real excitement is about the future and what I know will grow and develop from here. But I just wanted to make those comments to start with.
Well, thank you. And while we are very respectful and appreciative of what's gone on in the past, we appreciate your insight, because no one would know better than you whether or not the team is geared for success. So we really appreciate that, because we feel it, and I'm glad that you feel it as well. Why don't we take a look back and let's start at the beginning.
Well, of course, beginning is a moving target. I mean, if we had Bill Maul, our retired head of research here, he would probably go back 60 million years when dinosaurs were roaming around to where the clay deposits that we mine and process were laid down. But I usually start by talking about the early recorded incidences of the use of fuller's earth. Those are reported back as far as 7,000 years ago in various places, including the Bible, both in the Old and New Testament, where a fuller was someone who used absorbent earth to remove oil from sheep's wool. And so in ancient times, and there are many reports of fullerias in Italy and in the Mediterranean where materials like those which we mine and process were used for their cleansing purposes. And so that's really the beginning of the absorbent industry on a global basis.
Well, good. Well, let's move ahead maybe some 6,900 years then. And how did these minerals get commercialized here in the U.S.?
Well, they became associated with the processing of petroleum. As you know, oil was found in western Pennsylvania in the middle part of the 19th century. And just like it is today, it was brought out of the ground in a crude form. And absorbent fuller's earth was used to remove impurities in very similar ways to our pure flow products and ultra clear products today. And so two of the major oil companies, Standard Oil Company and Atlantic Refining, got involved in supporting, or actually were active in developing fuller's earth mining activities in primarily the area around Quincy, Florida. And those are two companies that began mining and processing absorbent clays at the beginning of this century.
And then how did Oil-Dri get started?
Well, as you know, your grandfather, my dad, Nick Jaffe, founded this company in 1941. Now, he had attended a small mining college in southwestern Wisconsin, not so much because he was so excited about geology as a career, but he was a pretty good basketball player. And as he told me the story, when the mining college coach lost his team, he recruited my dad out of high school. It's kind of like, I guess, going into the NBA before you go to college. And so he had some exposure to natural resources and mining activities in the 1920s when he attended the Platteville School of Mines. But he pursued a career as an industrial salesman, and at the beginning of the Second World War in 1941, he was selling products that were made from rubber and metal. And he became concerned that he wouldn't be able to get those anymore. His customers were really kind of the Walmarts of his time. They were Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Wards and so forth. And so he started to spend some time looking around for a product that he could either make or sell that would be used in the war effort, because factories were all converting to war production and gearing up for the war effort. And somebody suggested to him that if he could find a way to take the oil off the floors — they were using sawdust at the time, which really wasn't a very good absorbent and was flammable — if he could find a way to do that in a safer fashion, that he might develop a real business. And so he realized that if absorbent clays were being used in oil refining purposes, maybe they could be used to absorb oil off of floors. And hence, he got the idea to put granular fuller's earth in a bag, and he took your Uncle Bob, my brother Bob, and me with him to the Sears Roebuck garage over here on the south side of Chicago, and cleaned up a grease pit and sold that first bag to Sears Roebuck in 1941. Started the company, started the product Oil-Dri, and really got the modern absorbent clay industry going in this country.
So in the beginning, we were a distributor of industrial absorbents.
Yes, that's absolutely true. He had other people, these companies who were making clays for the oil refining industry. He convinced them to start bagging the product, and essentially a private label arrangement, maybe a lot like where we make products for Clorox or Walmart, and they do the selling. And so he formed a company, which was a wholesale distribution business, and he carried that on through the 1940s and well into the 1950s.
Okay, so 1960-ish comes along and you take over, and then we started to acquire the plants?
Yes, actually, when I went to work for Oil-Dri in 1958, my dad had taken a small percentage ownership in two production plants. One in Ripley, Mississippi, which was the beginnings of our plant there, and the other in South Georgia in Grady County at Cairo, Georgia. He owned about 20% of each of those two plants.
Okay, and then, okay, so you said you took over in 1958, and let's talk about the 60s then. Let's focus on the growth and what went on there.
Well, I think in the 1960s, clearly there were two major developments that are important to focus on. The biggest single one, certainly, was the purchasing of those two small production plants, the expansion of their mineral reserves, because they had limited reserves, and we bought and leased land, some of which we are continuing to mine on even today, and then developing an understanding of the production and mining and processing techniques required to improve our quality, to reduce our costs, and to make sure that we could compete effectively with the companies who were in the industry at that time. And incidentally, it's very interesting because we have large competitors today, but large competitors have never really been a great concern of mine, because when I started in the business, frankly, everybody was bigger than we were, and by many times over. We had many very large competitors, most of which who have either exited the business or really have not been very effective in their competitive activity. So expanding the plants and integrating the production, learning what that was all about, was a big effort in the early part of the 60s. As we ended the 60s, we expanded the product line, got more active in the cat litter business, started to move into the agricultural carriers business, and then a big event was moving overseas. About in the 1967 or 68, we started to look to Europe as a growth area to expand our business.
Well, then let's transition into the 1970s. As we've said, the 60s were a time of vertical integration and starting to diversify, especially globally. What did the 70s bring us?
Well, the 70s, it was interesting. We realized that we needed more capital. We needed more capital to replace the small, antiquated plant we had at Cairo, and we bought the site up in Thomas County north of Ocklackney that we occupy. But it was a big number to build that facility, and it was a big challenge. And so we realized we needed to raise more money, and we looked to the public markets to do that. And that's when we went public in June of 1971. Now, in conjunction with that, we separated the business that my brother had developed, the Ampco Wire Corporation. That became a privately held company, and Oil-Dri, as I say, went public. We continue to push hard in the European arena, developed our relationships with our Spanish suppliers, built plants in Cologne, Germany, and in the United Kingdom. And at the end of the 70s, we expanded our production facilities by buying the Christmas Valley operation out in Central Oregon. So it certainly was a very dynamic period. We built that plant at Ocklackney and expanded it many times over, as we did all the facilities that we had during that period.
Well, it's exciting that the decisions that were made in the 60s helped grow the company in the 70s, and the decisions that were made in the 70s, I know the end of the story, helped to lead the growth in the 80s and the 90s. Why don't you take us from 1980 to the present?
Well, yes, and it's interesting that 79 and 80, well, really 79 to 82 were really sort of pivotal years. We were on a track of expanding our industrial business very extensively and moving aggressively in Europe. And then as things happen, change is always with us, and we ran into two recessions in 79 and 81, and the industrial base of this country crumbled. The middle western United States, which was our strongest markets, became the Rust Belt. Many of our customers either went out of business or changed their names, and so the industrial absorbent business really fell upon hard times. In Europe, we had great difficulty with our supply situation, and our partner became our competitor, and that, of course, was a very difficult period. So we had to come up with a new strategy, and it's to a large extent, it's a lot like what you and your team have been going through in the last year or two and reevaluating and setting a new course for the future. And the two critical elements I think that should be emphasized as we entered into the 1980s were we realized that the cat litter business was coming into its own, that it was a very demanding business from a market perspective, and so we started to look around for a marketing partner who could help us to move into the consumer market most effectively. And we also realized that we needed to emphasize technology and expand what at that point was a very fledgling and crude R&D effort. So we said there were two courses we were going to chart. One was to find this partner in marketing for cat litter, and the other to expand our technical and research capabilities. And that we did with great enthusiasm as we moved into the 1980s. Some of the things that I think we're most excited about and proud of course, were the contract and arrangement that we developed with Clorox.
Clearly the Clorox relationship was a big winner for this company. Were there any other type of relationships that were as big to the company?
Well, yes, of course, when one talks about our major customer relationships, names come to mind like Monsanto and ADM, but really the biggest one along with Clorox would be Walmart. And as you know, Dan, because you were heavily involved in it, we've been doing business with Walmart since the early 1970s. But just in the second half of the 80s, after the sale of our Cologne plant and the purchase of Favored Products, another opportunity developed, and that was the purchase of what is now our Blue Mountain facility. And fortunately, that coincided with Walmart's desire to expand their cat litter business, and we became their exclusive supplier for Special Kitty, natural and premium, and so we desperately needed the capacity that the Blue Mountain facility afforded us. So we ended up the 1980s really in a very positive way, building on the strategy that I've already explained. As we moved toward 1990 and 91 and the celebration of our 50th anniversary, we focused on further refining our technical abilities and our research and development effort, culminating in the opening of the Vernon Hills facility and our pilot plant and the laboratory, which we're also proud of, just about the time that we celebrated our 50th anniversary. And from that has come our scoopable, Cat's Pride scoopable litter products, which, as you know, has been the driver of much of our sales growth here in the last few years. The development of our Pure Flow Supreme product, the understanding of how to make better agricultural chemical carriers, and the development of our strong relationship with Monsanto and others. So we really fulfilled the promise of the strategy that we developed at the beginning of the 1980s in the first couple of years of the 1990s.
Well, Dad, thank you very much for taking us from basically the beginning of time forward. You've been around for all of it. Well, maybe not all of it, but certainly from the beginning of Oil-Dri forward. And I really believe that one of our great corporate assets is our strong history, because it gives us the confidence to weather the bumps in the roads and to know that the future is going to be as bright as the past. So I really appreciate you taking the time to bring us up to speed on that.
Well, great, Danny. As you know, I enjoy sharing these reminiscences with you, but as I said at the very beginning, most of all because I think they will be the backdrop to greater successes for the future. So I applaud you and your team for the great job that you're doing.